Diane Mercer sighed as she dragged her designer carry-on through the busy airport terminal. After 3 hours of flight delays, her patience was wearing thin. The glossy brochure for the Diamond Elite Lounge promised an oasis of comfort and exclusivity, and she was determined to make the most of her premium credit card benefits. Our gate changed again, her husband Richard said, squinting at his phone. But at least we have 2 hours to relax in the lounge first. Diane nodded, adjusting her pearl necklace. At 48, she maintained the polished appearance expected of a senior marketing executive. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her cream-colored blazer remained unwrinkled despite the travel chaos. "Thank goodness. I need a proper drink after this nightmare," she replied. They arrived at the lounge entrance, where a young woman checked their credentials with a friendly smile. "Welcome to the Diamond Elite Lounge, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. Please enjoy your stay." The lounge was more crowded than Diane had expected. Business travelers tapped on laptops, while others enjoyed complimentary refreshments. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for the best seating area. "Let's sit there," Diane pointed toward the corner with plush chairs and a view of the runway. But as they approached, she noticed all the seats were taken by a group of well-dressed black professionals engaged in conversation. They appeared to be colleagues, speaking animatedly about presentation slides displayed on a tablet. Diane's lips tightened into a thin line. She turned to Richard and whispered, "Let's find a lounge attendant. These chairs should be available." Richard shrugged. "There are other seats over there, honey. It's not a big deal." "I didn't pay for premium access to sit in the regular chairs," she insisted, spotting a lounge attendant nearby. The young man in a crisp uniform approached with a professional smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "We'd like seating in the premium section," Diane said, gesturing toward the corner. "Is there a waiting list?" "I'm sorry, but that area is first come, first served. Those guests arrived about 30 minutes ago. I can offer you complimentary champagne while you wait for other seating to open up." Diane's frustration bubbled over. She glanced at the group again and muttered just loudly enough to be heard, "There are too many black people taking up the good seats anyway. Do they even belong in the VIP section?" The attendant's smile vanished. Richard's face went pale. "Diane," he hissed, "that's completely inappropriate." Nearby conversations stopped. The lounge seemed to grow quieter. One of the men from the group in the corner looked up, his expression unreadable. He was distinguished-looking, in his early 50s, wearing a tailored suit and stylish glasses. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Diane continued, her voice carrying in the now-silent lounge. "I paid good money for this access." The man in the corner stood up. He straightened his tie and walked toward Diane with calm, measured steps. Other travelers began to notice the tension, and a few discreetly took out their phones. "Excuse me," the man said politely. "I couldn't help overhearing your comment. My name is Marcus Johnson." He extended his hand, which Diane reluctantly shook. "I believe we should talk." Something in his confident demeanor made Diane uneasy. For the first time, she noticed the designer watch on his wrist and the subtle logo pin on his lapel, the same logo as the airline they were flying with. The lounge attendant looked at Marcus with immediate recognition and respect. "Mr. Johnson, is there anything you need, sir?" "No, thank you, Michael. I'd just like a moment with this passenger." Diane swallowed hard, suddenly realizing she might have made a terrible mistake. The silence in the VIP lounge felt heavy as Marcus Johnson stood before Diane. His calm demeanor made her discomfort even more apparent. Richard shifted nervously beside his wife, clearly wishing he could disappear. "Perhaps we should sit down," Marcus suggested, gesturing to some nearby empty seats. His voice was measured and professional. Diane followed reluctantly, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She clutched her designer handbag tightly against her chest like a shield. "I don't appreciate being confronted like this," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm simply a paying customer expressing concerns about the service." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your frustration with the crowded conditions today. Travel can be stressful for everyone." He paused, then continued. "However, I need to address your comment about too many black people in the premium section." By now, several passengers had their phones out, recording discreetly. The lounge attendant stood nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. "You misunderstood me," Diane said quickly. I didn't mean anything racial. I was just upset about the seating. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table between them. Diane glanced down and froze. The card read, Marcus Johnson, Executive Vice President and Majority Shareholder, Atlantic Sky Airlines. Richard's eyes widened in recognition. You're the Marcus Johnson, the one who was featured in Business Monthly last year. Marcus nodded. Yes, that's me. I started as a baggage handler 30 years ago and worked my way up. 5 years ago, I acquired controlling interest in the airline. He turned back to Diane. The people you were referring to are my executive team. We're returning from a leadership conference where we presented our new diversity initiatives. Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had just made racist remarks about the owner of the airline she was about to fly on, in front of witnesses. I didn't know, she stammered. Most people don't recognize me, Marcus said. I prefer to observe our operations firsthand without special treatment. It gives me valuable insights into the passenger experience. A woman from Marcus's group approached with a tablet. Sorry to interrupt, Marcus, but we need your approval on these final numbers before the board call. Thank you, Aisha, he said, quickly reviewing the document and signing with a stylus. Everyone, this is Aisha Williams, our Chief Financial Officer. Aisha nodded politely to Diane and Richard before returning to the group. The message was clear. These were high-level executives, not people who didn't belong in the premium section. Mrs. Mercer, Marcus continued, I believe in second chances and learning opportunities. The comments you made reflect assumptions that many people carry unconsciously, but those assumptions hurt real people, people like my colleagues who have earned their success through hard work and talent. Richard placed a restraining hand on Diane's arm as she opened her mouth to defend herself again. I think you should apologize, Diane, he said quietly. Before she could respond, a notification sound chimed from several phones around the lounge. A passenger nearby gasped and turned her screen toward her companion. It's already on Twitter, the woman whispered, but loud enough for Diane to hear. Someone posted a video of what she said. Diane's face drained of color. Her company had strict social media policies for executives. This could affect more than just her flight today. It could impact her entire career. Our flight to Chicago begins boarding in 40 minutes, Marcus said, standing up. I think we all have some decisions to make before then. As he walked away, Diane sat frozen, realizing that her thoughtless comment was about to have consequences far beyond this airport lounge. Diane sat rigid in her seat, her stomach in knots. Across the lounge, she could see passengers glancing at their phones, then looking up at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. The video was spreading faster than she could have imagined. I need to call work, she whispered to Richard, her voice shaking. Janet needs to know before HR sees it online, Richard nodded grimly. I think that's wise. I'll get us some water. As Richard walked away, Diane scrolled through her contacts with trembling fingers. Janet Woods had been her friend and colleague for 15 years. As the head of public relations, Janet would know how to handle this, or at least, Diane hoped she would. After 3 rings, Janet answered. Diane, I thought you were traveling today. Janet, I'm at the airport and something terrible has happened, Diane began, her voice low. There's a video going around. Wait, is this about an incident in an airport lounge? Janet interrupted, her voice suddenly professional rather than friendly. With racist comments? Diane's heart sank. You've already seen it? It just hit our social media monitoring system. Diane, your name is being mentioned, and your LinkedIn profile photo is being shared alongside the video. Janet paused. Tell me exactly what happened. As Diane explained, she watched Marcus Johnson across the room. He was on his phone too, speaking with a serious expression. Occasionally, he glanced in her direction. And then I found out he owns the airline, Diane finished, fighting back tears. The line was silent for a moment. Diane, I need to be honest with you, Janet finally said. This is extremely serious. Marcus Johnson isn't just any airline executive. He's a major figure in corporate diversity initiatives and sits on the board of the National Civil Rights Coalition. Diane closed her eyes in horror. I didn't know that. The company's official social media accounts are already receiving hundreds of messages demanding action. I need to bring this to the CEO immediately. Janet's voice softened slightly. As your friend, I'm sorry this is happening. As the PR director, I have to tell you to prepare for significant consequences. The call ended just as Richard returned with 2 bottles of water. How did it go? He asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Not good, Diane whispered. Janet says Marcus Johnson is some kind of diversity champion. Richard nodded. I looked him up while getting water. He's given TED talks about creating inclusive workplaces and was recently honored at the White House. Diane's phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from her company's HR department, with the subject line, URGNT, meeting required upon your return. Before she could open it, a lounge attendant approached their table. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, I need to speak with you about your flight arrangements. The young man's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide his discomfort. Mr. Johnson has requested some changes to your itinerary. Are we being removed from the flight? Diane asked, her voice barely audible. No, ma'am. Atlantic Sky Airlines does not discriminate against passengers, the attendant replied, emphasizing the word discriminate ever so slightly. However, your first-class seats have been reassigned. You'll be seated in economy class, in separate middle seats, for the duration of your journey. Richard nodded. We understand. Additionally, the attendant continued, your Diamond Elite Lounge privileges have been suspended pending review. I'll need to escort you to the general waiting area. As they gathered their belongings, Diane noticed several people filming them with their phones. Her cheeks burned with shame. Near the exit, Marcus Johnson stood waiting. He held the door open as they approached. Mrs. Mercer, he said quietly, I want you to know this isn't about punishment. It's about consequences and learning. Diane couldn't meet his eyes as she passed through the door, leaving the comfort of the VIP lounge behind. In just 20 minutes, her thoughtless words had changed everything. And based on the constant buzzing of her phone with notifications, she knew this was only the beginning. The general waiting area buzzed with activity as Diane and Richard found seats near their gate. Unlike the calm atmosphere of the VIP lounge, here they were surrounded by crying babies, loud conversations, and the constant announcements over the PA system. Diane stared at her phone, watching in horror as the view count on the video climbed. It had already been shared over 10,000 times. The comments were brutal. Say goodbye to your job, Karen. Her name is Diane Mercer, Senior Marketing Executive at Global Solutions Incorporated. I can't believe people still think they can get away with this in 2025. Richard sat beside her, unusually quiet. After 15 minutes of silence, he finally spoke. Diane, we need to talk about what happened back there. She looked up from her phone, her eyes red-rimmed. What is there to talk about? My life is over. My career is ruined. This isn't about your career right now, Richard said firmly. It's about what you said. Where did that come from? Diane blinked in surprise. In 20 years of marriage, Richard had rarely confronted her this directly. I was just stressed from the travel delays, she said defensively. You know I'm not actually racist. Do I? Richard asked. Because what you said in there, that wasn't just stress talking. That was something deeper. Before Diane could respond, an announcement came over the speaker. Atlantic Sky Airlines Flight 372 to Chicago is now boarding. We begin with our priority passengers. They watched as Marcus Johnson and his team lined up with other first-class passengers. Aisha, the CFO, glanced in their direction and whispered something to Marcus. He nodded, but didn't look their way. When economy boarding began, Diane and Richard joined the line. As they scanned their boarding passes, the gate agent's expression changed from professional to cool. Middle seats 28E and 42B, she said, handing back their passes. Separate boarding groups. Sir, you can board now. Ma'am, you'll need to wait for Group 5. Richard hesitated, looking at Diane. Go ahead, she said quietly. I'll see you in Chicago. As Richard disappeared down the jetway, Diane stood alone, feeling the stares of other passengers. Some were openly filming her with their phones. A young woman approached, her expression determined. Excuse me, she said. Are you the woman from the video? The one who made racist comments in the lounge? Diane felt her chest tighten. I don't want to talk about it. I think you owe people an explanation, the woman persisted. Do you know how hurtful comments like that are? An older black woman stepped between them. That's enough, she said firmly. Can't you see she's already being punished? Leave her be. The younger woman walked away, muttering under her breath. Diane looked at her unexpected defender with surprise. Thank you, she whispered. The woman shook her head. I didn't do it for you. I did it because public shaming rarely leads to genuine change. She studied Diane's face. You have a choice now. You can feel sorry for yourself, or you can use this as a wake-up call to examine why you said what you said. Before Diane could respond, Group 5 was called for boarding. As she walked down the jetway, she noticed airline staff watching her carefully. On the plane, she found her middle seat between a large man who spilled into her space and a teenager with blaring headphones. From this cramped position, she could see Richard seated between two chatty elderly women. Further ahead, in first class, she spotted Marcus Johnson working on his laptop. The flight attendant approached her seat. Mrs. Mercer, she said quietly, Mr. Johnson asked me to give you this. She handed Diane a folded note. Opening it with trembling fingers, Diane read. Mrs. Mercer, I believe people can change when they truly understand the impact of their words and actions. If you're interested in having a real conversation about what happened today, I'll be available to speak with you when we land. Sometimes the hardest moments in our lives become turning points. The choice is yours. Marcus Johnson. Diane folded the note and slipped it into her purse, wondering what awaited her in Chicago. The 3-hour flight to Chicago felt like the longest journey of Diane's life. Wedged uncomfortably between her seatmates, she could barely move. Each time someone walked past her row, she tensed, wondering if they had seen the video. Halfway through the flight, Diane's phone buzzed with an incoming call from her daughter, Jessica. Though airplane mode was required, she had forgotten to enable it in her distress. She quickly declined the call and properly switched her phone settings, but not before noticing 12 missed calls and over 30 text messages. Is that your phone? The flight attendant asked, suddenly appearing beside her seat. I'm so sorry, Diane said quickly. I just turned it off. The flight attendant gave her a disapproving look before moving on. Even this small interaction felt loaded with judgment. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Diane's anxiety intensified. Marcus Johnson's note felt heavy in her purse. Should she take him up on his offer to talk? What more could possibly be said? When they finally landed, passengers rushed to retrieve their bags and exit. Diane remained seated, allowing others to go ahead. She spotted Richard waiting in the aisle, his expression concerned. You okay? He asked when she finally stood up. No, she answered honestly. But let's just get home. As they walked through the terminal, Diane kept her head down. It didn't help. She heard the whispers. That's her. The racist lady from the video. Can't believe she said that. At baggage claim, Richard's phone rang. He answered, his expression growing more troubled with each passing second. It's Jessica, he said, covering the mouthpiece. She's at our house with her roommate. Apparently, there are news vans parked outside. Diane felt faint. News vans? For what? The video has gone national, Richard explained grimly. Someone identified you as the marketing executive for Global Solutions. The company's stock dropped 3% this afternoon. While waiting for their luggage, Diane's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Cynthia Barnes, Global Solutions CEO. Diane, I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Your presence is required. In the meantime, please refrain from making any public statements. Cynthia. No, dear Diane. No reassurances. Just cold, businesslike instructions. Richard, I think I'm going to lose my job, she whispered. Before he could respond, a familiar voice spoke behind them. Mrs. Mercer. They turned to find Marcus Johnson standing there, his carry-on bag beside him. Mr. Johnson, Richard acknowledged, stepping slightly in front of his wife. I was wondering if you had considered my offer, Marcus said, addressing Diane directly. She hesitated. I don't think now is a good time. There are apparently news crews at our house, and my company has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. Marcus nodded. I suspected as much. The video has over 1 million views now. He handed her a business card. When you're ready to talk, really talk, call this number. What happens next is partly up to you. As he walked away, Diane and Richard's luggage finally appeared on the carousel. They collected their bags in silence and headed toward the exit. Outside, the cold Chicago wind hit Diane's face. A few yards away, a woman was recording them on her phone. Beyond her, Diane could see a news van pulling up to the curb. "Richard," she said, her voice shaking, "I don't think I can face this." He squeezed her hand. "We'll get through it." "But Diane, things are going to change after today. They have to." As camera flashes began popping around them, Diane realized that her private moment of prejudice had now become very, very public, and the consequences were only beginning. The boardroom of Global Solutions Incorporated fell silent as Diane finished speaking. 8 executives sat around the polished table, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. CEO Cynthia Barnes, a stern woman in her 60s, removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Diane," she finally said, "I've known you for 15 years. We built this company together. That's why this is particularly difficult." Diane nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. She had barely slept last night. After dodging reporters at their home, she and Richard had spent hours discussing how they had arrived at this point. The video has been viewed 2.4 million times, Janet from PR reported, sliding a tablet across the table. Our social media accounts have received over 50,000 negative comments. 3 major clients have expressed concerns about continuing their contracts with us. Cynthia sighed. And Marcus Johnson isn't just any executive. Atlantic Sky Airlines is one of our biggest transportation partners. We book millions in travel through them annually. "I didn't know who he was," Diane said weakly. "That's not the point," Cynthia replied sharply. "You shouldn't have made those comments about anyone, regardless of who they were." The HR director, a middle-aged black man named Thomas, spoke next. "Diane, your comments violated at least 6 points in our code of conduct. As the head of our marketing department, you represent this company to the public." "I understand," Diane whispered. "Do you?" Thomas asked, his voice firm but not unkind. "Because I'm not sure you grasp the full impact. Our company has spent years building diversity initiatives. We've sponsored scholarships for underprivileged students. We've created inclusive hiring practices, and in one moment, you undermined all of that." Tears filled Diane's eyes. "I made a terrible mistake. I was stressed and tired. That's no excuse." Cynthia exchanged glances with the other board members before speaking again. "Diane, we've reached a unanimous decision. Your employment with Global Solutions is terminated, effective immediately." Though she had expected it, the words still hit like a physical blow. 15 years of her life, gone in an instant. "You'll receive 3 months severance pay," Cynthia continued. "But we request that you sign an agreement not to speak publicly about this incident as it relates to the company." Diane nodded numbly. "I understand." "Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings," Thomas added. "Your company accounts have already been deactivated." As she stood to leave, Cynthia called her name once more. "Diane." She turned back. "This isn't just about saving our company's reputation," Cynthia said quietly. "It's about standing for what's right. I hope you use this time to reflect on that." The walk to her office felt like a walk of shame. Colleagues averted their eyes as she passed. The security guard, a man she had greeted cheerfully for years, now maintained a professional distance. In her office, Diane found a cardboard box waiting. She began emptying her desk drawers, placing family photos and personal items inside. 15 years of achievements, reduced to a single box. As she removed the framed photo of her team from the wall, her assistant Sandra appeared in the doorway. "I just heard," Sandra said. "I'm so sorry, Diane." Diane shook her head. "Don't be sorry for me. I did this to myself." "What will you do now?" It was a question Diane hadn't even begun to contemplate. Her career had defined her for so long. Who was she without it? As she placed the last item in her box, her hand brushed against something in her jacket pocket. Marcus Johnson's business card. She had almost forgotten about his offer to talk. The security guard reappeared. Miss Mercer, I need to escort you to the exit now. With one last look at her office, Diane picked up her box and walked out, leaving behind the life she had known and facing an uncertain future shaped by 15 seconds of unfiltered prejudice. 3 weeks after the incident, Diane sat alone in her kitchen, staring at her laptop screen. The house was quiet. Richard had left for work hours ago. Their conversations had grown strained, with long silences filling the space between them. The job applications she had sent out over the past 2 weeks had gone unanswered. Each time, she wondered if the hiring managers had recognized her name or face from the video. The internet never forgot, and Diane Mercer had become a case study in what not to do on social media sites and corporate training programs. Her daughter Jessica had finally started taking her calls again, but their conversations remained awkward. "Mom, I just don't understand how you could say something like that," she had said during their last call. "My friends keep asking me about it." Diane closed her laptop and glanced at Marcus Johnson's business card, which had sat untouched on her counter for weeks. After hesitating, she finally picked up her phone and dialed the number. Marcus Johnson's office, a professional voice answered. "My name is Diane Mercer," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Johnson gave me this number. He said to call when I was ready to talk." There was a brief pause. "One moment, please." To her surprise, Marcus himself came on the line a moment later. "Mrs. Mercer, I've been wondering if I would hear from you." I wasn't sure if I should call," Diane admitted. "But you did," Marcus observed. "That suggests you're ready for a real conversation." Diane took a deep breath. "Yes, I think I am." They arranged to meet the following day at a small coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood, away from the public eye. When Diane arrived, Marcus was already there, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his business suit. "Thank you for meeting me," Diane said as she sat down across from him. Marcus studied her face. "You look different." "Unemployment will do that," she replied with a weak smile. "I lost my job, my daughter barely speaks to me, and my husband." She trailed off. "I'm not here to add to your punishment," Marcus said gently. "That wasn't my goal when I suggested we talk." "Then what was your goal?" Marcus leaned forward. "Growth, understanding, maybe even healing." For the next hour, they talked openly. Marcus shared stories of subtle discrimination he had faced throughout his career, despite his success. He explained how such comments affected not just the targets but entire communities. "When you said there were too many black people in that VIP section, what did you really mean?" he asked. Diane thought carefully before answering. I think I meant they didn't belong there. That somehow, that space was meant for people like me, not people like them." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "And saying it out loud makes me realize how awful that sounds." "It is awful," Marcus agreed, "but recognizing that is the first step toward change." As their coffee grew cold, Marcus made an unexpected offer. "Atlantic Sky is launching a new diversity training program for our staff," he explained. "We're looking for someone to help develop materials based on real experiences. Would you be interested in sharing your story? What you learned? How it affected you?" Diane looked stunned. "You want me to work with your company, after what I said?" Marcus nodded. "Sometimes the best teachers are those who have made mistakes and learned from them. This isn't charity, Diane. It's an opportunity to turn a negative experience into something positive." As Diane left the coffee shop later, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Her thoughtless words had cost her dearly, but perhaps they could also become the catalyst for genuine change, not just in her own life, but in others as well. That evening, when Richard came home, she was waiting with dinner prepared and Marcus Johnson's proposal laid out on the table. "I think I found a way forward," she said as he sat down. "It won't be easy, but it's a start." 1 year after the airport incident, Diane stood nervously backstage at the Atlantic Sky Airlines corporate headquarters. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see hundreds of employees filling the auditorium for the company's annual Diversity and Inclusion Summit. "Ready?" Marcus Johnson asked, appearing beside her in a crisp navy suit. Diane nodded, smoothing her simple black dress. "As ready as I'll ever be." Over the past year, her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Working with Atlantic Sky's diversity team, she had helped develop a training program called Words Matter, which used her own experience as a case study. The program had been so successful within the company that other corporations had begun to license it. Remember, Marcus said gently, "They're here to learn, not to judge you." The MC's voice boomed through the speakers. Please welcome our next speakers, Atlantic Sky Airlines CEO, Marcus Johnson, and diversity consultant Diane Mercer. The audience applauded politely as they walked on stage. Diane noticed a few whispers and pointing fingers. Some people still recognized her from the video. "Good morning," Marcus began. "A year ago, something happened that could have ended as just another viral video of bad behavior. Instead, it became the catalyst for one of our most successful training initiatives." He briefly recounted the incident in the airport lounge, then turned to Diane. "I'll let Mrs. Mercer tell you what happened next." Taking a deep breath, Diane stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Diane Mercer, and you may recognize me as the Karen from that airport video." A nervous laugh rippled through the audience. "I'm here today not to excuse what I said, but to share what I've learned since then." She spoke honestly about losing her job, facing public shame, and the painful conversations with her family. Then she described her gradual understanding of her own hidden biases. "I never thought of myself as racist," she explained. "I had black colleagues. I celebrated diversity days at work. But deep down, I carried assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces and who didn't." As she continued, the audience grew more engaged. Many were taking notes. Some nodded in recognition of their own hidden biases. "Working with Atlantic Sky hasn't erased my mistake," she concluded. "Nothing can do that. But it has given me the chance to help others recognize these biases before they lead to harmful words and actions." After the presentation, several employees approached to ask questions or share their own experiences. Among them was Aisha Williams, the CFO who had been part of Marcus's team in the lounge that day. "That took courage," Aisha told her. "Not everyone would have been willing to turn their worst moment into a teaching opportunity." Later, as Diane gathered her notes, her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. How did it go? Their marriage had weathered a difficult year, but the experience had ultimately brought them closer. Richard had supported her decision to work with Atlantic Sky, even when friends questioned it. As she typed a reply, Marcus approached with a woman Diane didn't recognize. "Diane, I'd like you to meet Letitia Moore. She's the diversity director at Global Solutions." Diane froze. Global Solutions, her former company. "Ms. Mercer," Letitia said, extending her hand. "Your presentation was powerful. We've been following the success of your program, and our CEO is interested in implementing something similar at Global. Cynthia wants to work with me." Diane asked in disbelief. "She believes people deserve second chances when they genuinely changed," Letitia explained. "Would you be open to meeting with us next week?" As Diane looked from Letitia to Marcus, she realized her journey had come full circle. The thoughtless words that had destroyed her career had also created a new path, one with more purpose and awareness than before. "Yes," she said with a smile. "I'd like that very much."